So for the past 8 years, I've been prevented from driving from the DVLA because I have this erroneous diagnosis from the NHS Mental Health Services of schizoaffective disorder, and this is one of the mental disorders that can supposedly impact your ability to drive. However, this is a misdiagnosis, and I suffer from obsessive compulsive disorder, PTSD, anxiety, and possibly bouts of depression here, there, and everywhere, which far from being a chemical imbalance, are almost certainly circumstantial. And yeah, they've been preventing me from driving, and they've also said that I'm unable to drive because I use cannabis for my mental health. Now, when it comes to cannabis and driving, this is a somewhat contentious topic, and a lot of people within government seem to believe that cannabis impairs driving ability. So I'm just going to read a little bit from the Wikipedia page on cannabis and driving, since actually I think in this case Wikipedia is probably about the most reliable source, and it has aggregated the available evidence from the various studies that have been conducted into the safety of driving with cannabis. So here we go. This is just the opening couple of paragraphs I'm going to read. Two main questions arise in the law surrounding driving after having ingested cannabis. One, whether cannabis actually impairs driving ability, and two, whether the common practice of testing for THC, the main psychoactive substance in cannabis, is a reliable means to measure impairment. On the first question, studies are mixed. Several recent extensive studies, including one conducted by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration and one conducted by the American Automobile Association, show that drivers with detectable THC in their blood are no more likely to cause car crashes than drivers with no amount of THC in their blood. Others show that cannabis can impair certain abilities important to safe driving, such as reaction time, divided attention, and cognitive functions, but no studies have been able to show that this increases the actual risk of crashing, or that drivers with THC in their blood cause a disproportionate number of crashes. On the second question, the studies that have been conducted so far have consistently found that THC blood levels and degree of impairment are not closely related. No known relationship between blood levels of THC, the main psychoactive substance in cannabis, and increased relative crash risk, or THC blood levels and levels of driving impairment, has been shown by single crash or classic control studies. Thus, even though it is possible that cannabis impairs driving ability to some extent, there are currently no reliable means to test or measure whether a driver was actually impaired. Nonetheless, policymakers in the United States, and in fact the United Kingdom, have generally dealt with cannabis and driving criminalisation by importing the alcohol DUI regime into the cannabis context. This has led to complications down the road when cannabis driving cases land in criminal court because cannabis detection sources differ vastly from alcohol detection science. For example, blood alcohol content, BAC, has similar rates of absorption, distribution, and elimination across all humans, and there is also a fairly good correlation between BAC and level of impairment. In other words, impairment increases when BAC increases, and impairment decreases when BAC decreases. This has allowed law enforcement to use tools like breathalyzers and blood tests in criminal court because alcohol concentration is a relatively reliable indicator of how recently and how much alcohol was consumed. In contrast, THC levels can vary widely depending on the means of ingestion. THC is metabolized at an exponentially declining rate as opposed to the steady metabolization rate for alcohol, and there is very poor correlation of THC blood levels with impairment. As stated in a report to Congress produced by the US Department of Transportation's National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, in contrast to the situation with alcohol, someone can show little or no impairment at a THC level, at which someone else may show a greater degree of impairment. The report also noted that in some studies, THC was detectable as late as 30 days after ingestion, even though the acute psychoactive effects of cannabis last only for a few hours. Those are the opening two paragraphs of that. So, what are we to glean from this? There is no evidence whatsoever that cannabis impairs driving ability. I've been in the car numerous times with people driving under the influence of cannabis. They are safer driving. This is actually what it says in the next section of this Wikipedia page. It says entitled "Effects on Driving." First paragraph is: Studies that are more carefully controlled and that actually measure marijuana THC use by drivers rather than relying on self-report generally show reduced crash risk estimates or no risk associated with marijuana use. What we are dealing with here is the dictates of a paranoid system of power. It is a paranoid system of power that they believe in delusions when it comes to cannabis. They are set in their opinions against the evidence, against strong contradictory evidence that cannabis either makes you a safer driver. That's what a lot of studies seem to be showing, or that it has no effect at all. It is very poorly correlated with impairment, cannabis use. And, because you've got a little bit of cannabis in your system for 30 days, when they inevitably give you the blood or the urine tests that they do to see if you can get your medical fucking driving license back, because you test positive for cannabis, they say, no, you can't have your license back. Do you know, like, how much this has impacted my mental health, being unable to drive? It's driven me into poverty. There's a world of jobs out there I could get and could be doing very capably. I was looking at one thing today, like an environmental consultancy internship, that because of this National Trust volunteer placement that I've got, that I'd be a prime candidate for a role like that in an environmental consultancy internship. But I need a driving license for it because you've got to travel between different sites. So, like, nothing about cannabis impairs driving ability. Quite the contrary. I've been in cars with stoners before. They are very safe drivers. They drive slowly, carefully, conscientiously, maybe even yet a little bit paranoid, a bit more careful than you need to be. A slight layer of unnecessary fear. So you check your mirrors a bit more, you slow down, longer following distance, all that. That's generally speaking how stoners drive vehicles. It's very telling, in the Victorian era, that there were laws against carriage drivers being inebriated with alcohol and train drivers. They weren't allowed to consume alcohol. There are no laws against cannabis, though. And cannabis was the number one over-the-counter painkiller back then. These laws, the way these systems operate, this is the insanity. I'm not the delusional one. I'm the one whose opinion is based in strong evidence. These people are deluded. The NHS doctors who don't stick up for your ability to drive, they're delusional. The DVLA, like the medics behind giving people medical licenses, they are paranoid. They're unnecessarily fearful of people who drive under the influence of cannabis. Cannabis does not impair your ability to drive. There is no evidence for it. It is undermined by evidence, that opinion. This is ludicrous. I must have lost £250,000 almost, assuming I'd been averaging sort of 26 grand a year with the ability to drive over 8 years or so. Yeah, well, maybe I'd be earning a little bit more than that even by now. So it could be even more money. It could be more like 300 grand. 300 grand. That's potentially what I've lost as a result of, because of what I choose to self-medicate with. Cannabis is very effective for my mental health problems. It treats my OCD. It treats my anxiety. Antipsychotics do not work. They exacerbate my OCD. Or they have no effect. And it carries on like this. This constant cycle of ineffective treatment. And then you see one psychiatrist, then another psychiatrist, then another psychiatrist. You get just pass between them because they don't want to deal with you. Because your objections and your questions are too uncomfortable for them to answer. And, I got part off from this one woman. I can't remember her name. She was South African. But she was very mute, very dogmatic as well, like they all are, but like rather unfriendly and intimidating. And I had one, I said all this stuff to her, and she was just like blank, and she was trying to palm me off and saying like, oh, we'll talk when Andy, this guy called Andy, who's like one of the community nurses or whatever, when he's present. And then that never happened, and I got passed off to some new guy who was like very flamboyant, very charming, highly engaging person, very intelligent man as well, but really just a salesman more than a salesman for medication. That's what it was. It was just an extended sales pitch. I'm not so easily taken in by all that. What convinces me is evidence, strong arguments underpinned by sound research. And all the research when it comes to cannabis and driving is pointing in exactly the same place and saying it has no effect or it makes you safer as a driver. So, like, what are we to do in the face of this? We're dealing with hordes of people in society who have strong, unfounded beliefs about the effects of cannabis on people. Like, number one, it causes psychosis. I think you'll be very hard pushed to divorce true cannabis psychosis cases from cannabis psychosis cases that involve alcohol or other drugs. The thing about cannabis is it sticks around in the system for 30 days. So when they're taking these piss tests from people who enter psychiatric hospital with psychosis, they've been using all sorts of things really, but most of what else they've been using, like alcohol, leaves the system in 72 hours. Crack cocaine gets out of the system pretty quickly, I think. Cannabis lingers in the system. So it's correlation without causation. Very often people with psychosis, in my opinion, they're going through alcohol withdrawal and they're seeing shit and hearing voices, which is what happens when you go cold turkey on alcohol. Alcohol is, across numerous factors, far more harmful than cannabis. I've used cannabis to get myself off alcohol, and it's been very effective for that reason. And to treat, just to relax myself and treat my mental health conditions without having to resort to booze. Yeah, that's why I use it. It's a safe alternative to a more dangerous drug. Like, and total sobriety. Like, well, I've tried that as well, but I find like I'm full of untreated mental health problems if I'm totally sober. Like, not many people actually are teetotal. It's quite unusual. I think most adults use alcohol at least a few times a week to relieve stress. To relieve stress after a hard day's work, have a glass of wine, or a glass of wine, right? More like half a bottle in a lot of people's cases, but like cannabis is a better alternative to relieve stress, anxiety, which loads and loads of people suffer from. Most people probably suffer from anxiety, I think, and we use it to calm that stuff down. It's only natural. It exists in the natural world. This asceticism, this is total abnegation. This is unwise discipline. This is hyper-authoritarian, austere, draconian thinking. that we should never take substances of any kind. And like, when it comes down to it, it'd be like, firstly, like, no alcohol. I agree, reduce alcohol at least. Then, like, no other drugs, no tea or coffee, nothing, no chocolate event. I don't know. And where does it end? We can't ever consume a substance and just have a bit of fun, for instance. Really? Is the policing of fun? Is the policing also of stuff that greatly benefits people? Now, I've known people who were drinking themselves to death. I know one person in particular who was drinking himself to death. We recommended he try cannabis. He got on with it. He started, going down from 4 bottles of wine a day to 3 bottles of wine a day. Eventually he entered hospital and, in a crisis situation, and had emergency treatment, an emergency detox sort of situation for alcohol, came out of hospital, and he smokes weed now, and that's sufficient for him. So he was eventually able to get off alcohol with, I think, the assistance of cannabis, and now does not drink, is doing fantastically well. That phenomenal improvement on every level, physically, mentally, emotionally, everything. He's flourishing. He's doing really well. And that has come down in part to cannabis, because after all, everyone pretty much does need a sort of crutch, unless you're like a monk or something, or it depends. Like, we want to live functioning ordinary life while taking substances, which is totally possible. Or, this unrealistic expectation of total abstinence from everything. And yeah, I don't know, like, what is more reasonable? That's what really carries weight in British law: reasonableness. And these prohibitions against people who smoke cannabis and driving, it is deeply unreasonable. It is not what a reasonable person would believe on the basis of evidence. If you survey the evidence on cannabis and driving and come to the conclusion that you should still ban stoners from driving, then you have a problem. You're actually psychotic by the standards of the DSM. You have a serious mental health problem if you believe that. If you can't be swayed by evidence, you're a delusional person, hence psychotic. So, people like banding about terms like delusional, mentally ill, loony, whatever. But 9 times out of 10, it's hypocrisy and it applies to them as well. And they apply it arbitrarily in any case, i.e. when they feel like it, when it doesn't accord with their prejudices, more like. And when it makes them uncomfortable to believe anything else. That's arbitrariness, not on the basis of sound reasoning and rational argument or evidence-based argument. It's a travesty. I can't believe it's still going on.